Hello and welcome to Unit 2, Part 2. I'm Mr. Bell, and today we're going to talk about simplifying using the distributive property, and we're also going to talk about factoring out a GCF, which stands for the greatest common factor. When simplifying and solving expressions and equations, you're going to run into a situation like this from time to time, okay? But you basically have a number on the outside, a parentheses, and a set of numbers or an expression inside the parentheses. And remember from an earlier lesson that if there's no sign between those, that implies multiplication. So this actually reads 5 times the quantity of 2x minus 3. Well, there's something we can do called the distributive property. Basically what we're doing is we're taking the value that's on the outside and we're distributing it, to both of the terms on the inside. And by distributing, we mean multiply. So this a gets distributed to the b, a times b is the result. And then a gets distributed to the c, which gives you the result of a times c. We're going to apply that to this particular example up here. It says 5 times the quantity of 2x minus 3. Let's distribute the 5 to the 2x first. 5 times 2x is 10x. But now we have to distribute that same 5 to the negative 3, the other term in the expression. 5 times negative 3 is negative 15. Now let's look at a few examples of using the distributive property. So this problem to the left says 3 times the quantity of a minus 6. And I know this means multiplication, so let's distribute that 3 to the a. 3 times a is 3a, that's pretty easy. And 3 times the other term, which is a negative 6, gives you a negative 18. That is using the distributive property to simplify. Next example has a negative 2 in the front. Let's distribute that negative 2 to each term. Negative 2 times x squared is negative 2x squared. You also have to distribute it to the negative x. Negative 2 times negative x makes a positive 2x. Remember, negative times negative is positive. And the last one is negative 2 times 4, which gives you a negative 8. Pretty straightforward. Last example says negative the quantity of y plus 10. Don't forget there's an understood 1 that they don't write in algebra. So what we're going to do is we're going to distribute this negative 1 to everything on the inside of the parentheses. Negative 1 times y is negative 1y. Negative 1 times 10 is negative 10. The next part of the lesson is kind of applying the same concept but in reverse, but backwards. It's called factoring out a greatest common factor. A lot of times they'll just put a GCF there. So what's happening is we have 12x minus 8. And if we want to factor out the greatest common factor, we need to look for the biggest number, the greatest number that can go into or be divided out of each of the terms. That implies that it's a factor. Factors are two things that multiply together to give you the result. So if we're looking at this 12x minus 8, if I'm thinking to myself, okay, what is the GCF? What's the greatest common factor that goes into both of them? You might think 2, okay, 2 goes into both of them, but we got to find a number, the greatest one. 2 is not the greatest common factor here. What I usually do is I start with the smaller number and I see if it can go into the larger number. 8 does not go evenly into 12, so then I go to the next factor of 8, which is a 4. 4 does happen to go into both of them. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to factor out a 4. It is the greatest common factor. But if you notice from the example here, you've pulled out the GCF, but you still got to write what's left on the inside after you factored out the greatest common factor. So if I pull out a 4, that's the same thing as dividing out a factor of 4 from each term. 12x divided by 4 is 3x, and negative 8 divided by 4 is negative 2. You could always check in the early stages while you're learning this concept by going back and using the distributive property to see if we get our original question. 4 times 3x is 12x, 4 times negative 2 is negative 8, and that is where we started. Now let's try a couple of examples of factoring out a greatest common factor. This one on the left, the 2x and the 12, I'm going to start with my smallest number and see if it goes into the larger one. 2 does go into 12, so I'm going to factor out a 2, and don't forget to write what's left. So I'm going to divide out that factor of 2 from both of them. 2x divided by 2 leaves me with just an x. 12 divided by 2 is 6. Next problem, we have 6x squared minus 12x plus 24. I'm going to look at my smallest number, the 6, 6 does go into 12. 6 does go into 24. So we're going to factor out a 6. I might think for just a split second that I could factor out an x, but this third term here does not have an x, so I can't do that. So if I factor out a 6, let's see what's left when I divide out a 6 from each of my terms. 6x squared divided by 6 leaves me with x squared. Negative 12x divided by 6 is negative 2x. And 24 divided by 6 is a positive 4. The last example says negative 10a plus 100. And what you may notice is that the leading coefficient here is negative. It's usually a good idea, if you're able to go ahead and factor out the negative component of it so that you're left with a leading variable or term inside your parentheses that's positive. So let's take a closer look. Does 10 go into 100? Yes, it does. So I can factor out a 10. But since it's a negative in the front, let's go ahead and factor out a negative 10. So I'm going to divide out a negative 10 from both of my terms. Negative 10a divided by negative 10 leaves me with just a. And 100 divided by negative 10 leaves me with a negative 10. All right, thanks for watching and hope this helps.